shivering in the freezing rain of a London alley. The former toast of Mayfair clutched her thin cloak around her rain-soaked sage-green gown as she stood at the threshold of the city's most notorious brothel. Her name was Lady Charlotte Fairfax. Just 3 years ago she had danced under glittering chandeliers in the arms of her charming husband, Lord Frederick Voss. Now she was a ghost, ruined, disgraced, and pushed to the edge of the abyss. Across the muddy cobblestones, hidden in the shadows, stood Benedict Hargrave, the Duke of Ravenscourt. His jaw was clenched, his gloved hand tight around his silver cane. For 5 long years he had loved this woman in silence. He had watched her marry another man. He had watched her fall. And now he watched her about to walk into hell itself. The biting winter of 1893 had been merciless. The Thames was frozen, yellow smog choked the streets, and society had turned its back on the disgraced widow. Freddie Voss's gambling debts and scandals had stripped Charlotte of everything: her home, her fortune, and finally her dignity. Creditors had given her one final degrading option: enter the Crimson Veil tonight, or freeze to death in the streets. With tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks, Charlotte took one trembling step toward the brothel door. That was the moment the Duke made his choice. Only 3 years ago, Lady Charlotte Fairfax had been the undisputed toast of London. With her warm chestnut hair and graceful figure wrapped in the finest silks, she had glided through the grand ballrooms of Mayfair like a vision. Under the blaze of crystal chandeliers, she had danced in the arms of the dashing Lord Frederick Voss, her laughter bright and carefree as he whispered poetic promises against her ear. Their wedding had been the event of the season. Flowers from Paris, a gown embroidered with seed pearls, and society papers declaring them the most enviable couple in England. Charlotte had believed every word. Freddie's charm had been intoxicating, his smile quick and roguish, his touch full of passion. She had chosen him over quieter suitors, drawn by the fire in his eyes and the excitement he promised. Now, in the brutal winter of 1893, that world lay in ashes. The fall had come swiftly and mercilessly. Freddie's charm, it turned out, had hidden a vicious gambling addiction and a string of reckless scandals. He had borrowed from dangerous men, forged signatures, and entangled the Fairfax name in debts so vast they swallowed estates whole. When he was found dead in a French chateau, whispers spoke of a heart attack brought on by terror rather than fate. The creditors descended like wolves. They seized the Belgravia mansion, the Sussex estate, the horses, the paintings, even the silver. Everything Charlotte had once called hers vanished overnight. Society, which had once adored her, turned its back with chilling speed. Invitations dried up. Friends crossed the street to avoid her. A destitute widow was unfortunate. A widow tainted by scandal was contagious. Whispers followed her everywhere. Fallen, ruined, disgraced. The very men who had toasted Freddie's wit now sneered at the sight of his widow. Charlotte had sold what little remained: pearl earrings, gold bracelets, silver combs from her hair, just to buy bread and coal. But the money never lasted. The final blow came when the last of Freddie's creditors made their demand. They no longer wanted possessions. They wanted her. The infamous Crimson Veil brothel had made a cold offer. 1 year within its walls would clear the remaining debts and give her a roof over her head. Humiliation burned in her chest like poison. The same woman who had once worn diamonds now stood shivering in a threadbare cloak, her sage-green gown faded and patched, her pride in tatters. The glittering ballrooms felt like a fever dream. The laughter, the music, the admiring glances, all gone. In their place was freezing rain, yellow smog, and the looming shadow of the brothel door. Lady Charlotte Fairfax, once the brightest star of the ton, had become a ghost haunting the alleys of Cheapside. And tonight, with rent due and hunger gnawing at her bones, she had reached the end of her endurance. One trembling step forward would seal her fate forever. Yet unseen across the rain-slicked cobblestones, a tall figure in a deep burgundy coat watched with clenched jaw and burning eyes. The Duke of Ravenscourt had waited 5 long years in silence. And as Charlotte stood on the precipice of ruin, he knew the time for watching had ended. The rain fell in icy sheets, soaking through Charlotte's thin charcoal cloak and plastering her sage-green gown to her body. Every step sent cold water sloshing into her worn boots as she made her way down the narrow, filth-strewn alley. Hunger gnawed at her stomach like a living thing. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. The last of her coins had gone to the baker for a stale loaf that was now long gone. This morning the landlord had finally thrown her out. He stood in the doorway of the damp room above the bakery, arms crossed, while 2 rough men carried her small trunk into the street. "You've got until nightfall," he had growled. "After that the Crimson Veil says they'll take you in one way or another." The words still burned in her ears. The infamous Crimson Veil was no secret in the East End. A lavish brothel catering to gentlemen of means, it promised protection and payment in exchange for a woman's complete surrender. The madam had sent word 2 weeks ago. 1 year of service and all remaining debts would vanish. It was not an offer. It was a sentence. Charlotte clutched the small velvet box hidden beneath her cloak, the last Harrington family brooch, her final thread of dignity. She had hoped to sell it at the old curiosity shop around the corner for enough money to buy 1 more week of freedom. Just 1 more week to think, to breathe, to find some other way. But deep down she knew there was no other way. Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks as she stopped before the heavy wooden door of Josiah Grimshaw's shop. The bell above it gave a mournful jingle as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood, dust, and desperation. The elderly pawnbroker looked up from behind his cluttered counter, his sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of her. Charlotte stepped forward on trembling legs and placed the velvet box on the scarred mahogany surface. With shaking fingers she opened it, revealing the beautiful cornflower blue sapphire that had once adorned her grandmother's gown at court. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's all I have left." Grimshaw leaned in, poking at the brooch with a dirty finger. £15, he grunted. "And that's generous. £15. It would barely cover the rent she no longer had and a few days of bread." Charlotte felt something inside her fracture. The woman who had once danced at Almack's now stood begging a pawnbroker for scraps while the shadow of the brothel loomed just down the street. She closed her eyes, fighting back a sob. Outside, hidden in the pouring rain across the alley, Benedict Hargrave, Duke of Ravenscourt, watched through the shop window. His gloved hand tightened around his silver cane until the knuckles whitened beneath the leather. The sight of Charlotte, soaked, broken, and offering her last treasure to that greedy old man, was more than he could bear. 5 years of silent love had brought him to this moment. He took 1 step forward, then another, his burgundy coat cutting through the downpour like a blade. Inside the shop, Charlotte extended a trembling hand toward the pitiful coins Grimshaw had placed on the counter. That was when the deep, commanding voice sliced through the tension. "The lady will not be accepting that offer." Benedict Hargrave, Duke of Ravenscourt, stood in the doorway like a storm made flesh. Rain dripped from the shoulders of his deep burgundy velvet coat, pooling at his polished boots. His dark eyes, sharp and unwavering, fixed first on Josiah Grimshaw, then on the trembling woman at the counter. Charlotte spun around, her tear-streaked face pale with shock. For 1 fleeting moment their gazes locked and the years melted away. He had loved her for 5 long, agonizing years. It had begun at a garden party in Richmond, where Lady Charlotte Fairfax, then still Miss Charlotte Harrington, had laughed at something trivial under the spring sun. Benedict had been about to approach her father when Lord Frederick Voss swept in with his poetic verses and reckless charm. Charlotte's eyes had lit up like stars. Benedict, ever the honorable man, had stepped back into the shadows. He had watched her fall in love. He had attended their wedding. He had danced with her once, holding her lightly as though she were made of glass, while his heart quietly shattered. He never stopped loving her. When news of Freddie's death and the mountain of scandalous debts reached him, Benedict had acted without hesitation. He hired the best investigators in London, spent small fortunes tracing every creditor, every IOU, every whispered rumor. For months he searched while Charlotte hid herself away in shame, slipping deeper into the East End like a wounded animal. He had almost lost her. Until this morning. A former maid's tip had led him here, to these freezing alleys. He had watched from his carriage as she was thrown into the street. He had followed at a distance as she made her way toward the Crimson Veil. And when she stepped into this dingy shop instead, clutching her last possession, something inside him had finally broken. No more waiting, no more watching her destroy herself out of pride. "The lady will not be accepting that offer," he repeated, his voice low and commanding, cutting through the dusty air like a blade. Josiah Grimshaw's face went slack with recognition. "Your Grace," he stammered, nearly dropping his loupe as he bowed awkwardly behind the counter. "I didn't realize—" £500, Benedict said coldly, stepping forward. He placed a leather billfold on the counter and counted out the crisp notes without once looking away from Charlotte. "For the brooch. And you will speak of this transaction to no one." Charlotte stared at him, her lips parted in disbelief. Rain still clung to her lashes. The faded sage-green gown beneath her soaked cloak made her look heartbreakingly fragile. Shame burned across her cheeks as she realized the Duke of Ravenscourt. The man she had once politely refused was witnessing her at her absolute lowest. "Your Grace, I cannot accept this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is charity." Benedict finally turned to her fully. His expression was not one of pity, but of fierce, protective intensity. "It is not charity, Lady Charlotte," he said quietly, only for her ears. "It is the first step in reclaiming what never should have been lost." Outside, the rain continued to hammer the cobblestones. Inside the dimly lit shop, the air crackled with unspoken years of longing, regret, and a love that had refused to die. Benedict Hargrave had spent half a decade in the shadows. Tonight, he stepped fully into the light. The heavy oak door of the curiosity shop had barely closed behind them when the truth crashed over Charlotte like a wave of freezing seawater. Benedict guided her gently but firmly down the rain-lashed alley, his large hand steady at the small of her back. She tried to pull away, but her legs were too weak from hunger and shame. "I must go," she whispered, voice barely audible over the downpour. "You don't understand. They're waiting for me." Benedict stopped. His dark eyes searched her face, reading the humiliation that burned there. "The Crimson Veil," he said, the name sounding like a curse on his tongue. Charlotte's breath hitched. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, mixing with the rain. She could no longer meet his gaze. "They made me an offer. 1 year, and my debts would be gone. I have nothing left, Your Grace. Nothing. Tonight was to be my first night." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. The once proud lady Charlotte Fairfax admitting she had been reduced to selling her body in a brothel. The shame was so overwhelming she wished the rain would simply wash her away. Benedict's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking furiously. Without another word, he turned and strode directly toward the glowing red lanterns of the Crimson Veil, his burgundy coat flaring like a banner of war. Charlotte hurried after him, clutching her thin cloak. "Wait, please!" But he did not wait. The Duke of Ravenscourt pushed open the heavy brothel door with such force that it slammed against the wall. Warm, perfumed air spilled out into the cold night, carrying the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and a violin playing somewhere in the shadows. Several elegantly dressed women looked up in surprise. The madam, a sharp-eyed woman in crimson silk, rose from her velvet chaise with a calculating smile that quickly faded when she recognized the man before her. "Your Grace," she purred, though her eyes were wary. "To what do we owe this unexpected?" "Lady Charlotte Fairfax will not be entering your establishment," Benedict declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Not tonight. Not ever." Charlotte stood frozen just inside the doorway, soaked and trembling, her sage-green gown clinging to her like a second shameful skin. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She wanted to sink into the floorboards. This was it, the final public ruin. The Duke of Ravenscourt claiming her in front of London's most notorious fallen women. The madam's smile turned sour. "The lady owes certain debts. I have purchased them all." Benedict cut her off. He pulled a thick envelope from inside his coat and tossed it onto a nearby table. "Every last one. Consider her account closed." A stunned silence fell over the room. Benedict turned to Charlotte. His expression softened only for her. He removed his own heavy burgundy coat and draped it around her shivering shoulders, the rich velvet still warm from his body. The gesture was possessive, protective, and impossibly tender. "Come," he said quietly. "You are leaving this place." Charlotte looked up at him through tear-filled eyes, her heart pounding with a storm of emotions. Shame, disbelief, and something dangerously close to hope. She let him guide her out into the rain once more, the weight of his coat enveloping her like a shield against the cruel world. As they stepped into his waiting carriage, she finally found her voice. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "After everything, after I chose him over you." Benedict settled across from her, his intense gaze never leaving her face. "Because I have loved you for 5 years, Charlotte," he said, voice low and raw, "and I will not stand by and watch you destroy yourself any longer." The carriage door closed. The horses moved forward through the storm. For the first time in months, Charlotte was no longer walking toward ruin. But the deepest shame and the greatest revelations still lay ahead. The carriage moved smoothly through the rain-slicked streets, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves and the drumming of rain on the roof. Charlotte sat huddled in the corner, still wrapped in Benedict's heavy burgundy coat. Its warmth and masculine scent surrounded her, but it did nothing to ease the storm raging inside her chest. She could not stop trembling. "Why?" she whispered again, her voice hoarse. "Why would you humiliate yourself by claiming me in that place?" Benedict watched her for a long moment, his dark eyes intense in the dim glow of the carriage lamp. Rain traced silver paths down the window behind him. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a thick bundle of documents tied with black ribbon. "Because I own your debts, Charlotte. All of them." The words landed like stones. Charlotte stared at him, her breath catching. "What do you own them?" "I mean exactly that," he said quietly. £42,000. Every promissory note, every mortgage, every filthy IOU your late husband signed. I bought them over the last 4 months. The banks, the bookmakers, the men who pushed you toward the Crimson Veil. They no longer hold any claim on you. I do." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. The carriage suddenly felt too small, too warm, too suffocating. She pressed herself deeper into the velvet seat, as though she could disappear into it. "So I have simply traded one master for another," she said bitterly, shame burning her throat. "First Freddie, then the brothel, now you. Is that it, Your Grace? Have you come to collect what you believe you are owed?" Benedict's jaw tightened. For the first time, raw emotion cracked through his usual stoic mask. "I did not buy your debts to own you," he said, voice low and fierce. "I bought them to set you free. No man will ever again threaten you, evict you, or drag your name through the mud. Not while I draw breath." Charlotte looked down at her hands, still raw and red from the cold. The faded sage-green gown beneath his coat felt like a mockery of who she once was. £42,000, she whispered. "That is a king's ransom. Why would you spend such a fortune on a ruined widow who chose another man over you?" Benedict leaned forward, his gloved hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. Because I have loved you since the day I first saw you at that garden party 5 years ago, he confessed, the words rough with long-suppressed emotion. I was ready to speak to your father. Then Freddie appeared with his poetry and his lies, and you looked at him the way I had dreamed you would look at me. I stepped aside. I told myself it was the honorable thing, but I never stopped loving you, Charlotte, not for one single day. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. The weight of his sacrifice pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. This man had quietly protected her for years, while she had been blind to everything but Freddie's charm. And now, after everything, after her public disgrace and her descent into the lowest depths, he was still here. The carriage slowed and turned onto a quieter, more elegant street. Through the rain-streaked window, Charlotte glimpsed a stately townhouse glowing with warm light. "Where are we going?" she asked, voice small. "To a house I keep for my aunt in Marylebone," Benedict replied. "It is fully staffed and completely private. You will stay there tonight. You will be safe. No one will touch you. No one will shame you." He paused, then added softly, "But I will not force my presence on you. I ask only that you let me protect you, at least until decide what you truly want." Charlotte clutched the edges of his coat tighter around herself, her heart torn between overwhelming gratitude and crushing shame. The Duke of Ravenscourt had just pulled her back from the brink of hell. But as the carriage stopped before the elegant townhouse, she wondered whether she had simply exchanged one cage for another. Even if this one was lined with velvet and guarded by a man who loved her, the townhouse in Marylebone was a world away from the freezing alleys of Cheapside. Warm golden light spilled from tall windows as Benedict helped Charlotte down from the carriage. She moved like a woman in a dream, still wrapped in his heavy burgundy coat, her soaked sage-green gown leaving damp trails on the pristine marble floor of the entrance hall. A kind-faced, middle-aged woman hurried forward. "Mrs. Higgins," Benedict said quietly, "Lady Charlotte will be staying with us. See that she is made comfortable. Hot bath, fresh clothes, and a proper meal. Nothing is to be denied her. Mrs. Higgins took one look at Charlotte's tear-streaked face and rain-soaked appearance, and clucked softly with maternal concern. "Come along, my lady. You'll catch your death." Charlotte allowed herself to be led upstairs, too exhausted to protest. The bedroom they brought her to was beautiful. Soft ivory walls, a roaring fire in the hearth, and a large copper tub already being filled with steaming water scented with rose oil. While servants worked silently, Mrs. Higgins gently helped her out of the ruined gown and cloak. As the filthy fabric fell away, Charlotte felt another wave of shame wash over her. This was the body that had nearly been sold in a brothel only hours earlier. She sank into the hot water with a broken sob. The heat seeped into her frozen bones, but it could not reach the cold knot of humiliation lodged in her chest. She scrubbed at her skin until it was pink, trying to wash away the memory of the crimson veil's red lanterns and the greedy eyes that had looked at her like merchandise. Later, dressed in a soft midnight blue silk gown that Mrs. Higgins had somehow procured, Charlotte sat before the fire with a tray of hot broth, fresh bread, roast chicken, and spiced wine. She ate slowly, every bite a reminder of how far she had fallen, and how effortlessly Benedict had lifted her back into comfort. Yet the luxury felt like chains. She kept waiting for the price. Men always demanded payment. Freddie had taken her youth and her reputation. The creditors had taken everything else. What would the Duke demand in return for £42,000 and this temporary paradise? A soft knock sounded. Mrs. Higgins entered, carrying a thick envelope sealed with dark wax. "His Grace left this for you, my lady. He said it contains the original documents of your debts. You may burn them if you wish. He has gone home for the night and will not return unless you send for him." Charlotte stared at the envelope long after the housekeeper left. She turned it over in her hands, feeling its dangerous weight. Freedom lay inside, or a new form of bondage. The Duke had pulled her from the brothel, paid a fortune, and then simply walked away, asking for nothing. That frightened her most of all. She rose and paced the elegant room, the silk gown whispering around her legs. The woman in the mirror looked almost like the old Charlotte. Clean, warm, beautiful again, but her eyes were haunted. Every time she closed them, she saw herself standing outside the crimson veil, rain-soaked and defeated, ready to trade her body for survival. Now a duke had intervened, a man she had once overlooked, a man who claimed to have loved her in silence for 5 years. Charlotte sank into a chair by the fire, clutching the envelope to her chest. The warmth of the room could not touch the chill of suspicion and shame twisting inside her. Was this kindness, or the beginning of something far more dangerous? She had escaped the brothel, but she was not sure she had escaped ruin. On the 4th afternoon, a battered leather trunk arrived at the Marylebone townhouse. Mrs. Higgins explained that the Duke had sent his men to retrieve Charlotte's few remaining belongings from her old room above the bakery. Among the threadbare dresses and cracked shoes was Freddie's old writing desk, the one item she had kept only because its brass fittings might fetch a few shillings. Charlotte sat by the window in the pale winter light, running her fingers over the scuffed leather. A sudden surge of anger rose inside her. This desk was the last physical reminder of the man who had destroyed her life. With a cry of frustration, she struck the side of it hard. There was a sharp crack. The bottom panel shifted. Frowning, Charlotte knelt and pried at the loose wood with trembling fingers. It popped free, revealing a hidden, velvet-lined compartment. Inside lay a small black ledger and a bundle of letters tied with rotting twine. Her heart hammered as she untied the string. The first letter was addressed to Freddie. The sender's name made her blood run cold, Malcolm Thorne. She began to read, and with every line the room seemed to tilt beneath her. Freddie had not merely gambled away their fortune. 4 years ago, during a shooting party at the Duke's own country estate, her husband had slipped into Benedict's private study and stolen £10,000 in unregistered bearer bonds. Malcolm Thorne, a ruthless underworld figure, had discovered the crime and blackmailed Freddie mercilessly, bleeding him dry with threats of exposure to Scotland Yard. Page after page revealed the extent of the betrayal, payments, threats, desperate lies. And then the final entry, written just weeks before Freddie's death. Alderley knows. He summoned me today. He traced the bonds. He has proof he is going to ruin me. Charlotte dropped the letter as though it had burned her fingers. The black ledger slipped from her lap. Benedict had known. For years, the Duke of Ravenscourt had known that the man she married had robbed him. Yet he had never pressed charges. He had never sent the authorities to their door in Belgravia. He had watched her wear gowns and jewels purchased with his own stolen money, and remained utterly silent. Even after Freddie's death, instead of destroying her reputation by exposing the theft, Benedict had quietly bought up every remaining debt to shield her. The weight of this truth crushed the air from her lungs. All this time she had believed herself ruined by simple bad luck and Freddie's recklessness. But the scandal ran far deeper, and Benedict had sacrificed his own justice to protect her name. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the letters to her chest. The shame she felt before was nothing compared to this. She had chosen Freddie over Benedict. She had been blind, foolish, and proud. And in return, the man she had overlooked had guarded her dignity at the cost of his own fortune and pride. Charlotte stood on unsteady legs, the black ledger still in her hands. "Mrs. Higgins," she called, her voice ringing with sudden, desperate resolve. "Send a messenger to the Duke of Ravenscourt immediately. Tell him I must see him tonight." The fire crackled in the hearth, but Charlotte felt only ice in her veins. The hidden truth had finally surfaced, and there was no running from it any longer. She was done hiding in shame. The grandfather clock in the drawing-room struck 8 as Benedict entered the townhouse. He wore impeccable evening dress, but the shadows beneath his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. Charlotte stood waiting by the roaring fire, dressed in the midnight blue silk gown, the black ledger and letters clutched tightly in her hands. The moment he stepped into the room, she threw the bundle onto the low mahogany table between them. Benedict's gaze dropped to the papers. For a fraction of a second, genuine shock flickered across his aristocratic features. Then his face hardened into an impenetrable mask. "Where did you find those?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Hidden in Freddie's desk," Charlotte replied, her voice trembling with fury and grief. "You knew. All this time you knew he stole from you £10,000. You had proof. You could have destroyed him, destroyed us both. Yet you said nothing." She stepped closer, tears burning in her eyes. "Why, Benedict? Why didn't you send him to prison? Why protect the wife of the man who robbed you?" Benedict walked slowly to the table, picked up the bundle of letters, and without a word tossed them into the flames. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. "Because a scandal of that magnitude would have destroyed you," he said at last, turning to face her. The emotional walls he had maintained for 5 years were finally crumbling. If Freddie had been convicted of theft, his assets would have been seized immediately. You would have been left destitute years ago, branded the wife of a criminal. Society would have torn you apart. I would not allow the woman I loved to suffer for a coward's crime. Charlotte's breath caught. The raw pain in his voice nearly undid her. "The woman you loved," she echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I chose him, Benedict. I humiliated you. I wore gowns bought with your stolen money and never once suspected. And still you protected me. Why? Why spend £42,000 and guard my reputation when I never deserved it?" Shame crashed over her like a tidal wave. She pressed a hand to her chest as if she could hold her breaking heart together. "I stood outside that brothel ready to sell myself, and you were still trying to save me. I don't understand how you can look at me without disgust." Benedict closed the distance between them in 2 strides. His hands hovered near her arms, desperate to touch her but holding back, terrified of crossing a line. "Disgust!" His voice cracked with fierce passion. "Charlotte, I have never seen anything but the woman I have loved from the shadows for 5 long years. Freddie deceived us both. But you were innocent. Your only crime was trusting the wrong man." He reached into his evening coat and withdrew a sleek leather portfolio, placing it gently in her hands. "This is your freedom," he said, voice rough. "Inside is a trust in your name with £50,000, irrevocable. There is also a first-class ticket to New York, a home waiting for you in Manhattan. No one will know your past. You can leave this nightmare behind." Charlotte stared at the portfolio, her heart shattering. "You're sending me away?" "I am setting you free," Benedict whispered, stepping back with visible pain. "I will not be another man who traps you. Take it. Go to America. Be safe. Be happy." The room fell into heavy silence, broken only by the crackling fire. Charlotte looked at the man standing before her. The Duke who had sacrificed justice, fortune, and years of his life for a woman who had never chosen him. The weight of his love, his quiet devotion, and her own shame became too much to bear. Tears streamed freely down her face as the final truth settled deep in her soul. She was no longer just battling the ghosts of her past. She was standing at the edge of the most important choice of her life. Charlotte stared at the leather portfolio in her hands, the ticket to New York feeling like a burning coal against her palm. The firelight danced across Benedict's face, revealing the raw vulnerability he had hidden for 5 long years. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling flames and the distant patter of rain against the windows. She thought of the freezing alleys, the crimson veils' red lanterns, the shame that had nearly swallowed her whole. Then she looked at the man standing before her. The one who had loved her in silence, protected her at great cost, and was now offering her complete freedom with nothing asked in return. Freedom wasn't a ship to America. Freedom was this. With deliberate, steady hands, Charlotte opened the portfolio, pulled out the first-class ticket, and walked to the fireplace. She dropped it into the roaring flames. The thick cardstock caught instantly, flaring bright orange before dissolving into ash. Benedict's eyes widened in shock. "Charlotte, what are you doing?" She turned to face him, her voice clear and strong for the first time in months. "I am making my choice." She crossed the room until she stood directly before him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body. The midnight blue silk of her gown brushed against his evening clothes. "You kept Fretty's crime secret to protect my dignity," she said softly, reaching up to rest her hand against his chest. She could feel his heart thundering beneath her palm. "You bought every debt to give me back my life. You offered me the world and asked for nothing in return. But there is one thing I want you to ask of me, Benedict Hargrave." His breath hitched. Slowly, almost reverently, his hands came up to rest on her waist. "Tell me," he whispered, voice rough with desperate hope. "Ask me to stay." Her eyes shone with tears of absolute certainty. "Not as your charity, not as your ward, but as your partner. Ask me to stay because you love me, and because I have been a fool for far too long not to love you in return." A ragged sound escaped Benedict's throat, half sob, half triumph. He pulled her flush against him, wrapping his arms around her with fierce, possessive tenderness. His face buried in her dark hair as he held her, like she was the most precious thing in the universe. "Stay," he murmured against her skin, his voice breaking. "Stay with me, Charlotte. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice this time." Charlotte wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder as the tears finally came, not from sorrow or shame, but from overwhelming relief and joy. The destitute widow who had stood outside a brothel in the freezing rain was gone. In her place stood the future Duchess of Ravenscourt, safe and loved at last. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the grime from the streets of London. Inside the warm, firelit drawing room wrapped in Benedict's strong embrace, Charlotte felt the ghosts of her past finally fade away. She had chosen love, and this time she had chosen wisely. The end. Did Charlotte make the right choice, or would you have taken the ticket to New York and started over? If this tale of shame, sacrifice, secret love, and ultimate redemption touched your heart, please like, comment, and share it with fellow romance lovers. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another passionate historical story. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Charlotte's place?